There is something unsettling about a voice that refuses to remain silent when silence has long been the custom. It does not begin with a shout, but with a disturbance, quiet, persistent, difficult to ignore. In the case of Friedrich Nietzsche, this disturbance takes the form of a question that lingers beneath the surface of inherited truths. What if the world we trust is built upon illusions we no longer have the courage to examine? He does not arrive as a distant authority, but as a man already fractured by the tension between what is and what claims to be. His thought is not born in comfort. It emerges from a deep unease, a sense that something essential has been lost beneath layers of morality, religion, and cultural habit. At the same time, he is not simply rejecting these structures, he is listening to them, probing them, almost as if searching for a pulse that may already have stopped. This is where the silence begins to crack. For centuries, certain ideas were treated as immovable: the goodness of truth, the authority of God, the stability of moral law. Nietzsche does not attack them with immediate certainty. Instead, he hesitates, observes, and then asks, what if these are not eternal truths, but human creations? The question is simple, yet it carries a quiet violence. It does not destroy outright. It destabilizes. Psychologically, this moment is delicate. To question the foundations of one's world is to risk losing not only belief, but orientation. There is a subtle fear here, often unspoken, the fear that without these inherited meanings, nothing will remain. Nietzsche seems aware of this. He does not rush to fill the void. He allows it to open. He lingers in it. Yet something remains unclear. Is this act of questioning an act of liberation, or the beginning of a deeper crisis? Nietzsche himself embodies this ambiguity. He is both the one who breaks the silence and the one who suffers from what follows. His writing carries a strange duality, at times sharp and almost joyful in its defiance, at other times heavy with solitude. It is as though he senses that to speak truthfully is also to become isolated from those who prefer the comfort of illusion. This leads to a deeper question. Why do we cling so strongly to what may not be true? The answer perhaps lies not in reason, but in need. Human beings do not seek truth alone. They seek stability, meaning, a sense of belonging. Religion, morality, and tradition provide this. They create a shared world. To challenge them is not merely an intellectual act. It is an existential risk. And yet Nietzsche proceeds, not recklessly, but inevitably. His thought suggests that there is a cost to silence, just as there is a cost to breaking it. To remain silent is to live within structures one has not chosen. To speak is to face the uncertainty of freedom. Neither path is without suffering. There is also a tension within Nietzsche himself, one that quietly unfolds beneath his words. He criticizes the values of his time, yet he cannot fully escape the human need for value. He dismantles belief, yet he continues to search for something that might replace it. This contradiction is not a flaw. It is the very movement of his philosophy. He does not offer a stable ground. He reveals the instability of all grounds. In this way, Nietzsche's voice is less a conclusion than a beginning. It invites, but does not instruct. It unsettles, but does not resolve. And as the silence continues to break, slowly, unevenly, one begins to sense that the question he raises is no longer his alone. It has already begun to echo. The voice that once disturbed the silence now begins to reveal what that disturbance truly means. It is no longer only a question, but a slow recognition. Something foundational has already begun to give way. When Friedrich Nietzsche writes that God is dead, he is not announcing a victory, nor is he simply rejecting belief. He is describing a condition, almost like a physician diagnosing an illness that has long been spreading unnoticed. At first, the words may seem distant, even abstract, but they carry a quiet weight. For centuries, the idea of God was not only a matter of faith, it was the center around which meaning, morality, and purpose revolved. To say that this center no longer holds is to suggest that the structure of life itself has begun to loosen. The ground does not collapse all at once. It trembles. At the same time, this collapse is not immediately visible. People continue to live as they always have. They work, they speak of right and wrong, they make plans for the future. Yet something subtle has shifted beneath these actions. Nietzsche senses a kind of delay, a gap between the death of belief and the awareness of that death. It is in this gap that a quiet unease begins to grow. This unease is not always recognized as such. It can appear as restlessness, as distraction, as a constant search for something undefined. It may even take the form of optimism, a belief that progress or reason will replace what has been lost. Yet something remains unclear. Can meaning simply be rebuilt, as if nothing essential has changed? Or does the loss of a shared foundation alter the very way in which meaning is experienced? Psychologically, the situation is fragile. Human beings are not indifferent to meaning. They depend on it. Without a stable framework, there is a risk of drifting into what Nietzsche later calls nihilism, a condition in which values lose their weight and actions begin to feel empty. But this is not a sudden descent into despair. It is quieter than that. It is the slow realization that the reasons one once trusted no longer feel convincing. This leads to a deeper question. If the old values were human creations, even if unrecognized as such, what prevents new values from being created? Nietzsche does not deny this possibility. In fact, he gestures toward it. Yet he also recognizes the difficulty. To create values is not merely to invent them intellectually. It is to live them, to embody them, to give them a kind of reality that others can feel. This is a far more demanding task than preserving inherited beliefs. There is also a tension within Nietzsche's thought at this point. On one hand, he sees the collapse of certainty as an opportunity, a release from constraints that no longer serve life. On the other hand, he is acutely aware of the danger. Without guidance, freedom can become disorientation. Without shared values, individuals may turn inward or cling to shallow substitutes. The space left by faith does not remain empty for long, but what fills it is not always clear. In literature and culture, this moment echoes in subtle ways. One can sense it in the uncertainty of characters who no longer trust the worlds they inhabit, in the fragmentation of narratives that refuse to offer clear resolutions. Even in earlier thinkers, such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, there is a recognition of this tension, the fear that without God, everything might be permitted, and yet the simultaneous awareness that belief cannot simply be restored by will. And so the collapse of certainty is not a single event, but an unfolding process. It moves quietly, almost invisibly, shaping thoughts and feelings before it is fully understood. Nietzsche does not offer comfort here. He does not rush to replace what has been lost. Instead, he lingers in the instability, as if suggesting that to understand this moment, one must first learn to remain within it. Yet something continues to stir beneath this uncertainty, a question not yet fully formed, but already present. If the old foundations are gone, and if new ones cannot be easily established, then what kind of life becomes possible in their absence? Out of the quiet collapse, something new begins to emerge, though it does not arrive with clarity or comfort. The absence of old certainties does not leave a peaceful emptiness. It opens a space that feels at once vast and unstable. Within this space, freedom appears, but not as a gift easily received. For Friedrich Nietzsche, freedom is not the removal of limits alone. It is the sudden exposure to responsibility without guidance. At first, this freedom can feel almost unreal. One is no longer bound by inherited meanings in the same unquestioned way. The structures that once defined good and evil, purpose and direction, have loosened their hold. And yet, this does not produce immediate relief. Instead, there is hesitation, a pause, because without those structures, the question of how to live does not disappear. It intensifies. At the same time, something within the human psyche resists this openness. There is a quiet longing for direction, for something already formed, already certain. To be free in Nietzsche's sense is not simply to choose among options. It is to face the necessity of creating value itself. This is where the weight begins to be felt. It is not the burden of external authority, but the pressure of having no authority beyond oneself. Yet something remains unclear. If values must be created, what gives them legitimacy? What prevents them from becoming arbitrary or fragile or empty? Nietzsche does not resolve this tension. Instead, he draws attention to it. The act of creation, he suggests, must come from a deeper source, not from convenience, but from a kind of inner necessity. A value must be lived before it can be believed. Psychologically, this is a demanding position. It requires a strength that is not commonly cultivated. Many, faced with such freedom, may turn away from it, seeking substitutes that resemble the old certainties. Ideologies, systems, identities, they can all serve as new shelters, but Nietzsche seems wary of these. He senses that they often repeat the same pattern, offering security at the cost of genuine freedom. This leads to a deeper question. Is freedom something human beings truly desire or something they fear? The answer, perhaps, is both. There is a tension between the wish to be self-determining and the need to be guided. In literature, this tension appears again and again. One can feel it in the restless characters of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who struggle with the terrifying possibility that without absolute authority, moral boundaries may dissolve. Freedom, in this sense, is not simply empowering. It is destabilizing. Nietzsche does not deny this danger. In fact, he seems to embrace it as an unavoidable part of becoming. To be free is to risk error, to risk isolation, even to risk suffering. There is no guarantee that the values one creates will endure or that they will lead to fulfillment. At the same time, to refuse this risk is to remain confined within borrowed meanings, never fully confronting the question of one's own existence. There is also an inner conflict here, subtle but persistent. Nietzsche calls for the creation of new values, yet he recognizes how rare such creation truly is. Not everyone can bear this weight. Not everyone can stand without the support of inherited truths. This acknowledgement does not weaken his vision, it deepens its complexity. Freedom is not equal in its demands. It reveals differences in strength, in resilience, in the capacity to endure uncertainty. And so, freedom becomes something heavier than it first appeared. Not a release, but a task. Not a simple condition, but an ongoing effort. It asks for attention, for courage, for a willingness to remain in tension without immediate resolution. One begins to sense that the absence of certainty is not the end of meaning, but the beginning of a more difficult relationship to it. Yet even here, in this growing awareness of responsibility, something continues to unfold quietly beneath the surface. A question, still incomplete, but becoming more insistent. If freedom demands creation, and creation demands strength, then what kind of self is capable of carrying such a weight? As the weight of freedom begins to settle, it reveals something that was always present but rarely acknowledged. The difficulty is not only in choosing or creating values, but in the one who must choose. For Friedrich Nietzsche, the human being is not a single, unified voice speaking with clarity and coherence. It is something more restless, more layered, a field of tensions. At first, this realization can feel disorienting. One may have assumed that beneath confusion there exists a stable self, waiting to be discovered. Yet Nietzsche suggests otherwise. What we call the self is not a fixed center, but a shifting interplay of forces, instincts that pull in different directions, thoughts that contradict one another, desires that do not easily reconcile. There is no final harmony waiting beneath the surface. There is movement. At the same time, this division is not necessarily a defect. It is easy to interpret inner conflict as weakness, as something to be resolved or eliminated. But Nietzsche approaches it differently. He sees conflict as a sign of life, of complexity, even of potential. A being without tension would also be without depth. It would be still, perhaps even peaceful, but not capable of transformation. Yet something remains unclear. If the self is divided, how can it act with purpose? How can it create values, as freedom demands, if it is pulled apart by competing impulses? This leads to a deeper question. Is unity something to be achieved, or is it an illusion we impose in order to feel secure? Nietzsche seems to lean toward the latter. He does not promise a final reconciliation of all inner forces. Instead, he suggests that becoming is always incomplete. Psychologically, this introduces a subtle shift. Instead of seeking to eliminate contradiction, one begins to observe it. The struggle between reason and instinct, between fear and desire, between what one is and what one might become. These are not obstacles to life, but its very texture. In this sense, even suffering takes on a different meaning. It is no longer merely something to avoid, but something that reveals the depth of these inner tensions. In literature, this divided nature appears again and again. One can sense it in the characters of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who move between faith and doubt, love and cruelty, often within the same moment. They are not consistent, yet they are intensely human. Their contradictions do not cancel them out, they define them. At the same time, there is a danger in recognizing this division. Without some form of orientation, the self may fragment further. The awareness of conflicting drives can lead not to growth, but to paralysis. One may hesitate, uncertain which voice to follow, or whether any voice can be trusted. Nietzsche does not ignore this risk. He acknowledges that the path through inner conflict is not guaranteed to lead upward, and yet he returns to the idea of becoming, not as a final state, but as a process shaped by these very tensions. The self is not something to be discovered fully formed. It is something that takes shape through struggle, through the interplay of its own contradictions. In this sense, unity is not given. It is something provisional, something that emerges for a time, then dissolves again. There is also a quiet implication here, one that touches on broader themes of good and evil. If the self contains multiple forces, some creative, some destructive, then moral clarity becomes more complex. What appears as evil in one moment may be tied to strength in another. What appears as good may conceal weakness. Nietzsche does not simplify these distinctions. He allows them to remain unsettled. This can be unsettling, but also strangely liberating. It suggests that to be human is not to achieve purity, but to endure complexity, to hold opposing forces without immediate resolution, to act even when certainty is absent. And so, the divided self does not close the question of freedom, it deepens it. If one is not a single will, but a tension of many, then the act of creating meaning becomes something more intricate, more demanding. It is no longer only about choosing, but about shaping the very forces that make choice possible. Yet even this shaping remains incomplete, always in motion, as if something within continues to resist final form. As the inner divisions of the self become more visible, attention begins to shift towards something that once seemed unquestionable. Not the self alone, but the standards by which the self judges itself. What is called good, what is called evil, these words have long carried an air of certainty, as if they pointed to fixed truths beyond dispute. Yet for Friedrich Nietzsche, this certainty begins to waver under closer examination. He does not reject morality outright. Instead, he asks where it comes from. This question, simple on the surface, carries a quiet disruption. Morality is often treated as something given, something discovered, perhaps even something sacred. But Nietzsche approaches it as something formed, shaped over time by human needs, fears, and struggles. At the same time, this approach does not immediately destroy moral values. It makes them unfamiliar. There is a certain discomfort in this unfamiliarity. To consider that one's deepest convictions might have origins in something other than truth, perhaps in weakness, or in the need for protection, can feel unsettling. Yet something remains unclear. If morality is not absolute, does it lose all authority? Or does it gain a different kind of meaning, one that is closer to human experience but less stable? Nietzsche's analysis often turns toward what he calls resentment, a quiet but persistent force within human psychology. It is not always visible. It does not announce itself openly. Instead, it works slowly, shaping values in indirect ways. Those who feel powerless, he suggests, may come to redefine goodness in terms that favor their condition: humility, obedience, self-denial. What cannot be achieved outwardly is transformed inwardly into virtue. This leads to a deeper question. Are our highest values expressions of strength, or are they responses to limitation? Nietzsche does not offer a simple answer. He reveals a tension. On one hand, moral systems can provide order, stability, even a sense of dignity. On the other, they may conceal deeper instincts: fear of chaos, fear of difference, fear of life's unpredictability. At the same time, there is a risk in this kind of questioning. If morality is exposed as contingent, as historically shaped, one may begin to doubt not only specific values, but the very possibility of value itself. The ground becomes uncertain again. And yet Nietzsche does not seem to regret this uncertainty. He treats it as a necessary stage, a kind of clearing in which new possibilities might emerge. In literature, similar tensions appear in figures who struggle with the weight of moral judgment. One can sense this in the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, where characters wrestle with guilt, freedom, and the haunting question of whether moral law is divine or human. Their suffering is not only personal, it reflects a deeper instability in the values they inherit. Psychologically, this instability can be both revealing and dangerous. To see through morality is not the same as being free from it. The old values may lose their clarity, but they do not disappear immediately. They linger, often unconsciously, shaping reactions and judgments. One may reject them intellectually, yet still feel their pull. This inner contradiction becomes part of the ongoing tension of the self. And so morality, once a firm guide, becomes something more ambiguous, not a clear path, but a field of interpretation. What was once certain now invites scrutiny. What was once unquestioned now demands reflection. This does not simplify life. It complicates it. It asks for a different kind of honesty, one that does not rest easily on inherited answers. Yet even here, something remains unresolved. If morality can be questioned, if its origins can be traced to human conditions rather than eternal truths, then what follows from this awareness? As the question of affirmation lingers, as the individual is asked to face life without illusion and to shape meaning from within, the focus begins to widen. The struggle is no longer only internal. It unfolds within a world shared with others, a world shaped by habits, expectations, and unspoken agreements about how one ought to live. It is here that Friedrich Nietzsche introduces a quieter but no less powerful danger, the pull of the herd. At first, this pull does not appear threatening. It feels natural, to belong, to be understood, to move in harmony with others. These are deeply human desires. They offer comfort and a sense of safety. One does not need to justify oneself constantly, nor carry the full weight of decision alone. At the same time, this comfort comes with a subtle cost. It asks, often without words, that one adjust, that one soften what is different, that one align with what is already accepted. This adjustment is rarely dramatic. It happens gradually. A thought left unspoken, a doubt set aside, a preference reshaped to fit what is familiar. Over time, the individual may begin to forget where these small compromises began. The voice of the self becomes quieter, less distinct. It does not disappear, but it blends into something larger, something shared. Yet something remains unclear. Is this blending always a loss, or is it also a necessary part of living together? Nietzsche does not deny that communities require some degree of agreement. Without it, life would become chaotic, perhaps even unbearable. But he questions the extent to which this agreement shapes values themselves. When what is called good reflects not strength, but the need for stability, something essential may be obscured. Psychologically, the herd offers a kind of relief. It reduces uncertainty. It provides ready-made answers. One does not need to create meaning if it has already been defined. And yet, This relief can become a quiet limitation. The individual no longer confronts the deeper questions, not because they have been resolved, but because they have been replaced. This leads to a deeper question. What is the cost of belonging if it requires the loss of oneself? The answer is not simple. To stand apart is not an easy alternative. It brings with it a different kind of burden, one of isolation, of misunderstanding, sometimes even of rejection. Nietzsche is aware of this. He does not romanticize separation. He recognizes that the individual who resists the herd does not step into clarity, but into uncertainty. In literature, this tension appears in figures who cannot fully belong, who sense that the values around them do not align with their inner experience. One can feel this distance in the characters of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who often move between the desire for connection and the impossibility of complete conformity. Their solitude is not chosen lightly. It emerges from a deeper conflict. At the same time, Nietzsche's critique carries its own tension. If the herd suppresses individuality, does the individual risk becoming detached, even indifferent to others? Can the pursuit of self-creation lead to a kind of isolation that loses sight of shared human experience? Nietzsche does not fully resolve this. He allows the tension to remain, as if suggesting that neither complete conformity nor complete separation offers a final answer. And so, the danger of the herd is not simply in its presence, but in its quiet influence. It shapes without forcing. It guides without declaring itself. To become aware of it is already to step slightly outside it, yet never entirely beyond it. The individual remains within society, even as they question it. They move among others, even as they listen for a different voice within. And in this delicate balance between belonging and becoming, something continues to unfold, uncertain, unfinished, still seeking its form. As morality begins to lose its unquestioned authority, another element of human experience comes into sharper focus, something more immediate, more difficult to ignore. Suffering, once explained or justified through moral or religious frameworks, now stands exposed. It no longer fits easily into a larger story. And yet, for Friedrich Nietzsche, this exposure does not reduce suffering to meaninglessness. It changes the way it must be understood. At first, there is a natural impulse to avoid pain, to see it as something purely negative, something to be minimized or escaped. This impulse is deeply human. It seeks comfort, stability, a sense of safety. But Nietzsche pauses here. He does not deny the reality of suffering, nor its intensity. Instead, he asks whether avoidance is the only possible response. At the same time, he suggests that in constantly turning away from pain, something essential may be lost. This leads to a subtle shift in perspective. Suffering is no longer viewed only as an obstacle, but as a condition that reveals something about the individual. It exposes limits, certainly, but also capacities. The way one responds to suffering becomes significant. Not all responses are equal. Some diminish the self, narrowing its possibilities. Others, though more difficult, seem to deepen it. Yet something remains unclear. How can pain, which often feels destructive, become a source of transformation? Nietzsche's answer is not immediate, nor entirely comforting. He introduces the idea of the will to power, not as a desire to dominate others, but as a more fundamental drive to shape one's own existence. It is a movement inward as much as outward, a tension that seeks expression. In this sense, suffering becomes a kind of material, not something chosen, but something encountered. The question is not whether it exists, but what is done with it. This does not mean that suffering is good in itself. Nietzsche is careful, though not always explicitly, to avoid such simplification. Rather, it is the response to suffering that carries meaning. The transformation is not in the pain, but in the one who endures it. Psychologically, this demands a different orientation. It requires a willingness to remain with discomfort, to resist the immediate impulse to escape or explain it away. This is not passive endurance, it is active engagement, though often quiet and inward. One begins to shape oneself through the encounter with difficulty, not by eliminating it, but by integrating it. In literature, this process appears in characters who are changed by what they suffer, not in spite of it, but through it. One can sense this in the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, where suffering becomes a site of inner transformation, though never without ambiguity. It can elevate, but it can also destroy. The outcome is never guaranteed. At the same time, Nietzsche's view carries a tension that cannot be easily resolved. If suffering can be transformed, does this risk justifying it? Does it make pain necessary or even desirable? Nietzsche does not fully answer this. He seems more concerned with possibility than prescription. The will to power is not a rule to follow, but a force to recognize, a tendency within life to expand, to overcome, to become more than it was. This leads to a deeper question. What does it mean to shape oneself? Is it an act of control or something more fluid? The self, already divided and uncertain, does not simply impose form upon itself. It negotiates, struggles, resists. The will to power does not eliminate this complexity. It moves through it. And so suffering, once something to be explained away, becomes something that cannot be easily dismissed. It remains difficult, often unwelcome, yet it also reveals a dimension of human existence that is otherwise hidden. Not a solution, but a process. Not an end, but a movement that continues, quietly, shaping what one might still become. Out of the tension, the doubt, and the long confrontation with suffering, a quieter possibility begins to take shape. It does not appear as a solution in the usual sense, nor as a system that can be easily followed. It feels more like a direction, uncertain, yet persistent. For Friedrich Nietzsche, the question is no longer only what has been lost, but what might still be formed in its absence. To become who one is, this phrase carries a strange weight. It suggests that the self is not simply given, but also not entirely invented. There is something already present, yet not fully realized. At the same time, this something is not fixed or stable. It is more like a potential shaped by experience, by conflict, by the very forces that once seemed to divide the individual. This idea of becoming does not promise comfort. It requires attention and a kind of honesty that is not always easy to sustain. One must look at oneself without the protection of illusions, without relying on inherited values to provide direction. This can feel exposed, even disorienting, and yet, within this exposure, there is also a subtle freedom, the freedom to shape rather than simply to follow. Yet something remains unclear. If one is to become oneself, what guides this process? Without external authority, How does one avoid drifting into arbitrariness or self-deception? Nietzsche does not offer a clear answer. Instead, he introduces a figure, not as a model to imitate, but as a symbol to consider. The Übermensch is not a perfected being, nor a distant ideal of power in the ordinary sense. It represents a movement, a way of relating to life that embraces transformation rather than resisting it. At the same time, this figure carries its own ambiguity. It can be misunderstood as domination, as superiority over others. But Nietzsche's deeper suggestion is more inward. The overcoming is not primarily of others, but of oneself, of one's limitations, fears, and inherited constraints. It is a process without final completion. One does not arrive, one continues. Psychologically, this requires a delicate balance. Too much rigidity, and the self becomes fixed, unable to grow. Too much fluidity, and it dissolves into uncertainty. Becoming who one is means remaining within this tension, shaping it without resolving it entirely. It asks for patience, for endurance, for a willingness to return again and again to the question of what one is becoming. In literature, one can sense this movement in characters who do not simply discover themselves, but are gradually formed through their struggles. There is no single moment of clarity, no final revelation. Instead, there is a series of encounters, some painful, some illuminating, that slowly give shape to a life. Even in the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, where inner conflict often leads to extremes, one finds traces of this process, though rarely in a stable or resolved form. This leads to a deeper question. Is authenticity something that can ever be fully achieved, or is it always in motion? Nietzsche seems to suggest the latter. To become who one is not to uncover a hidden essence, but to participate in an ongoing creation. It is to take responsibility for the direction of one's life, even when that direction is uncertain. And so, after the collapse of certainty, after the weight of freedom and the recognition of inner division, something like a path begins to emerge, not clearly marked, not secure, but present. It does not remove difficulty. It does not eliminate suffering, but it offers a different relation to them. A quieter strength begins to form here, not loud, not absolute, but steady in its movement. And as this movement continues, it begins to suggest that what lies ahead is not a final answer, but a deeper unfolding of the same question. As the movement of becoming continues, as the self is shaped through tension, suffering, and the quiet work of creation, a final question begins to emerge, one that gathers everything that has come before and turns it inward. It does not present itself as a conclusion, but as a test. For Friedrich Nietzsche, this question takes the form of a strange and unsettling thought. What if this life, exactly as it is, were to return again and again, endlessly, without change? At first, the idea feels distant, almost abstract. It can be heard as a kind of metaphysical speculation, something to consider and then set aside. But Nietzsche does not seem interested in it as a theory about the structure of the universe. He introduces it more quietly, more personally, not as a fact to believe, but as a possibility to confront. Imagine, he suggests, that every moment, the smallest hesitation, the deepest sorrow, the briefest joy, would repeat, not once, but infinitely. Nothing could be altered, nothing could be erased. Life would not move toward a final resolution. It would circle back upon itself. The question is not whether this is true. The question is how one responds to it. At the same time, this thought carries a peculiar weight. It does not accuse, and it does not command. It simply asks. Yet, something remains unclear. Would such a return be experienced as a blessing or as a burden too great to bear? The answer is not immediate. It reveals itself slowly in the quiet reflection on one's own life. Psychologically, this question reaches deeper than moral judgment. It does not ask whether one has been good or evil according to any established standard. It asks whether one can affirm one's life as it has been lived, not in parts, not selectively, but as a whole. This includes suffering, failure, regret, everything that one might wish to leave behind. This leads to a deeper question. What would it mean to live in such a way that one could say yes to this return, not as an act of resignation, but as an expression of acceptance, even of affirmation? Nietzsche does not suggest that this is easy. On the contrary, it may be one of the most demanding challenges he presents. It requires a relationship to life that does not depend on escape or on the hope of something beyond. At the same time, there is a subtle transformation in this perspective. If each moment carries the weight of eternity, then even the smallest action becomes significant, not because it is judged, but because it is repeated. Life is no longer a path leading elsewhere. It becomes something that must be lived fully in itself. In literature, echoes of this idea can be felt in works that linger on the irreversibility of time, on the way moments shape a life in ways that cannot be undone. There is a quiet resonance here with the struggles of characters in Fyodor Dostoevsky, who often confront the consequences of their actions not as abstract guilt, but as something that remains with them, shaping their existence. And yet, Nietzsche's thought moves beyond guilt. It asks not whether one can be forgiven, but whether one can affirm. This is a different kind of challenge. It shifts the focus from judgment to creation, from regret to responsibility. The life one lives is not measured against an external standard. It is weighed against itself. Still, there is tension here. To affirm everything may seem to risk accepting even what is painful or unjust. Does this mean that suffering must be embraced without question? Nietzsche does not fully resolve this. He leaves the tension intact. The affirmation he gestures toward is not simple acceptance, but something more complex, a transformation of how one relates to what cannot be changed. And so, the thought of eternal return does not close the journey. It opens it further. It gathers the fragments, freedom, conflict, suffering, creation, and reflects them back as a single question, one that cannot be answered once and for all, but must be lived. And in the quiet that follows, the question lingers, almost unchanged, yet somehow deeper now.